Today's guest delivers a practical strategy guide for attracting, retaining, and empowering the talent you need to drive your business forward. He describes the contemporary reality of work, how it is evolving, and how it represents a new opportunity for leaders to create organizations capable of innovation and growth. He explains how to straddle the challenge of building a company that is both a hyper efficient machine and a healthy living organism. It is a pleasure to welcome the author of Future Work World: How Leaders Can Create Destinations for Talent That Excite, Entice, and Engage, Chief Strategy Officer at CPL and head of the Future of Work Institute. Barry Winkless, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Aidan.
For full transparency, Barry and I used to work together. So it's great to see you writing, Barry, and getting this out to the world because you were constantly getting towards this. It was only a matter of time.
We did a white paper 6 years ago in the Future Work Institute because really recognized there was no definition of what the future of work was or a user guide for the future of work. So we tried to develop a relatively simple white paper around what it is, what's it about, what it contains, etc., etc. And then I think we started talking a couple of years ago, and really through the work that we've done in the Future Work Institute, the white papers that we'd written, and then some of the conversations we had. And I also felt, to be honest with you, it was a good time to do a book about work when you consider all the changes that are happening around us through technology and other societal impacts as well. So it's finally good to have it out there.
The one thing I know is you're not a boring writer, and you didn't create a boring book, because even though people might hear it's a playbook for the world of work or the future of work, your personality is very much in it. And I know music has a huge influence on your writing and your thinking as well. And indeed, you told me you learned the guitar during COVID, a new thing you added. But maybe we'll talk about the musical influence because it's throughout the book.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think there's a couple of things you probably appreciate this. I think what ends up happening when you do your first draft of a book, you realize, is there enough of me in the book? And to be honest with you, I felt no, not really. So I ended up going back to, well, what do I really love, right? I love music. I love things like science fiction, I love writing, I love all these various types of things. So the book is a little bit of a smorgasbord of all of those ideas. So right down to the point that at the back of the book, I call out a number of albums that you should listen to whilst reading the book. So that's how far I went on that side. I think the biggest influence on me, and you know this well, is I have a huge appreciation for immersive storytelling. So in the book, it's like a journey. So it's been broken up into 4 parts. Each part is unique, so you can read each part on its own, without necessarily reading the next part. I'm always mindful of keeping people engaged. And it goes from mindset, so how do we need to think about the future of work, to the meta waves, which is, the big underlying trends. But then I go into a lot of the work that we developed as part of the Future Work Institute. I go into this idea of a mixed desk. So what are the 16 areas that we can innovate around how we design our worlds of work? And then finally into this idea of move. How can we actually utilize immersive storytelling to emotionally move people? And throughout the book, again, trying to sprinkle that little bit of me in there. There are 9 jumps into the near future of work that are fictional stories that highlight different aspects of the future of work based on our research. So there's a bit of everything in there. Even in my introduction, I compare my first book to the first album, and everything in between. So yeah, it's a pretty accessible book. And I did an interview yesterday where the guy who read it said, whilst it's a book for business leaders, it's actually a book for everyone, which I really love that feedback. As you know, Aidan, trying to write something that engages people, but also is relatively universal. It's quite a difficult thing to do, particularly when you actually sit down to do the bloody thing. So that was my learning. My other learning was next time do a coffee table book. 50 pictures and 50 pages.
Just pictures. Anna and Barry at the farm.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. I had this vision of a Tom Ford-esque fashion book with big pictures. And those little semi-paragraphs, of content, per page. So that if anybody's asked me what my next book is, it's that.
Absolutely. If people even have tables anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Lap books.
Well, one of the things I found interesting was, and I was delighted to see this actually, was you did start with mindset, because no matter what you're talking about, like I heard this great saying recently that the whole idea is that you can't force a horse to water, but Actually, it's
Yeah,
worse than that. You can't waterboard a horse. So
yeah, very true.
so leadership team need to have the right mindset before they even look at what the future of work is for their organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know this is a big, kind of focus area of yours, Aidan, over the last few years. And what I was finding is in the projects that we were doing as part of the Future Work Institute, it was almost that we were going into a project without giving the leaders the dictionary. So they didn't know the language or the reason we were doing things. And that's why, and also I read your book as well. And I had read a couple of books that had focused in on, you know, I suppose, what would you call it? Level setting your mind, right? And then there was three very unique aspects to the mindset that I wanted to bring to bear. So one is called the destination designer, one is called the societal whisperer, and then the other one is the systems architect. And they came out of working with various HR teams, particularly leadership teams or teams involved in the world of talent, recognizing that those three areas were kind of the level setting area before you could go on the journey ultimately. So I was very mindful of that really halfway through writing the book. When I started writing the book, I didn't have a mindset section. And then I actually recognized myself, well, if somebody was coming to this book cold, would they get the maximum value out of this supposed user manual? And that's when I said, oh, hold a second, this is what we found from the companies we work with. So to me, it was a really important breakthrough for myself in terms of the book. And then also what I've found, Aidan, is that I've gotten very good feedback from people that I've done projects and workshops with since the book around the power of those three elements to the mindset. So I was very, very glad I had spent time on that. And as you know, Aidan, we work together. A lot of it is mindset. And even in the book, I say, look, we can talk about skills all we like, but the most important skill set for the future work is a mindset. And I'm really, really passionate about that.
One of the things that emerged from me, and even when we worked together, it's a decade ago now almost, but you would say stuff, say, because you're extremely well read, and I wasn't quite as well read then, and you'd say stuff, and I had no idea what you're talking about, and you don't know that because I can feign that I know what you're talking about. But the
Yeah,
reason
yeah.
I say that is mindset for me is also you level up. So you level up with your
Yes,
knowledge.
yeah, yeah,
So as you said,
yeah.
you need a different language in order to level up as well, because language is how we carry. It's like an operating system for the human,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah, 100%.
that piece comes
Yeah.
across that you're actually, you said there that you're giving them a language, but it really helps them level up. And also as a leadership team, they're on the same page then.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because, it's interesting you're talking about that. Even when we work together, there's a there's an unconscious osmosis that goes on. So I learned a lot about from you, from stuff that you went through, let's say as a professional sports person, and then you've gone through your own journey into innovation. So like I always, I'm one of those. I'm not saying I rob people's stuff ever, but I love osmosis. You know what I mean? I love that idea of, geez, Aidan's after saying something there that really I really thought about. I know we sometimes would speak different languages, but we always had this passion around the power of thinking and the power of all of that kind of stuff. I think that's really, really important to me. And the mindsets, in a way, they're almost like vessels. It's almost like, here's three vessels. As long as you adopt these principles, you can kind of fill these with new methods and new tools and all that kind of stuff. I didn't want to get too caught up in toolkits, you know what I mean? But I wanted to make sure there was enough there that was universal enough. And I've seen it, you hear a lot of people talking about, HR aren't strategic enough, blah, blah, blah. I'd look at it slightly differently. I would say that HR aren't holistic enough, in the way that they maybe look at challenges or look at opportunities, and never before has there been an opportunity for, HR leaders to really help craft this, startingly different, I'm going to say, world of work, but also similar at the same time. Yeah, so I just love that idea of, bringing new language to bear into, and this anyway, into sectors that maybe wouldn't be used to these types of approaches. And look, as we all know, there's nothing new under the sun. So even the book itself, like, the book is very, very original. There's elements from everywhere in there. Like even in the third part of the book, which is this mixed desk idea. Like, I got that from an uncle of mine had a music room, and he used to have like mixed desks, and I used to run in as a kid and mess with all the settings. And that was really important to me because yourself, I didn't want to have a book where it was like, the future of work will be. There's no, if somebody's looking for a really strong theme, the main theme in the book really is, we need to think more strategically about the future of work. That's it. But in there is mindsets and mixed tests to imagine and reimagine worlds of work. And sometimes you might have to go backwards, sometimes you have to go forwards. And for me, it was really important that it didn't become this standing on the mountaintop, preaching around this has to be like this, because I'm a realist. As I said, I head up the Future Work Institute. We work on projects that are important to businesses. That if we make a mistake, it's ROI and all that kind of good stuff. So I just was really mindful of that, Aidan, that it was more of a guide, a design guide, but it wasn't necessarily making any massive statements about this is definitively where things are going to go. Because yourself, and like it's leaders and people like ourselves and other people that write the future of work. So we can't definitively say it's going to 100% be this or that or the other. So that I was mindful of that in the book. So that's hopefully what will be reflected when people read the book, is this idea of a journey, a user guide that they can utilize in their own context. That was really important to me, because what to say. You've seen those books out there, and this is the team, this is what's going to be, and they're great books. They challenge your mind, but that's not what this book is.
The mixing desk really resonated with me. There was a lady we had on the show, Friederike Fabricius, and she writes about the brain and the future, the leading brain, the workplace brain, stuff like this.
Yeah.
But she has this term that she co-opted. It's called neurosignature. So everybody has their own setting, like you were saying, like your uncle's musical setting, a graphical equalizer, the way I pictured it, like the old hi-fis for those who remember them. But everybody has a setting that works for them of serotonin and oxytocin, etc. So they actually experience the world very uniquely to themselves. So there's neurodiversity. And the reason I share that is you were saying there about the different idea, like a systems architect. And when a different organization talks about HR, the leadership team have a different idea of what HR does. And therefore the setting of the organization is very unique.
Exactly.
And I thought that's why this book's so useful, because it's not saying this is the ideal setting. It's going, you need to see what setting you are first and then use the book.
Yeah, no, 100%, Aidan, and you're absolutely right. The thing for me was, look, so the easiest way I can describe it is, here's 16 equalizers. We know that these are the important ones from a workplace of the now and next, but play around based on your context. So that whole section around mixed desk is literally a whole methodology of how to bring this into your organization. Because I was and you'll appreciate this, Aidan, you can have a little bit too much right brain, and if you don't have a bit of the left brain, it can kind of go off I have a tendency to go off into space sometimes. So I was mindful of, making sure that what I'd learned in my team and the work projects that we've done was also reflected in there. So in a way, it's, you mentioned the neurodiversity thing, and that was really important to me, because I was mindful of making sure that this resonated with left and right brain people. I want to keep it simple. I know it's more complicated than that, but people who are more creatively inclined will resonate with the fictional stories. People who are more practically inclined will resonate with the model. But the idea was that you could utilize the book, and between those 4 sections, you almost have this user guide that you can apply tomorrow, really, no matter what size your organization is, And I always like to say that, just to come back to the equalizer analogy, no matter what type of an organization you are or how tight things are, you can at least move one of those equalizers. You know what I mean? And that was really important to me as well, because I've seen companies that are really good at one area, and that's enough, you know what I mean, in terms of what they're about. So I knew the mixed desk would resonate with you, I know conversations we've had over the years. So and funny, and that was the thing that we had trialed back in the white paper that we've since evolved through working with the organizations, and again, I was mindful it wasn't a big academic framework, but there was enough rigor behind it that it's really, really useful, and useful was my core idea in my head. How can this be useful really, to people? And my next book might be a little bit more esoteric,
Yeah, the pictures can be whatever way. But
exactly. I want those big pictures.
Let's share the meta waves, because mindset was one thing. Meta waves to me were almost like lenses that you can back to the
Yeah,
idea of like I can try on the lens and see how the world looks through that meta wave and see does it work for
yeah,
me and my organizational setting, my mixed desk setting.
yeah,
But some of them I
yeah.
loved. I mean, I loved, and this is a chance for you to freestyle with your creativity, like work type salad, stuff like that.
Oh yeah, everybody loves that one. Yeah, yeah. I'll talk about that one. So I'll tell you where that one came from. As you know, Aidan, I'm a big fan of Disney, particularly the Imagineering side of things. The theme park design side of things, which is actually there's a lot of concepts of immersive storytelling reflected in the book. But there's a very famous Imagineer called Rolly Crump. He was one of Walt Disney's right hand men, and he talked about the fact that Disneyland was like the perfect salad. You know, perfectly mixed salad, everything blended together. And he said other amusement parks are just like lettuce and tomato, and it really and it really stuck with me. And it's so when I talk about this idea of work type salads, if you think about the modern workforce, it's actually made up of all types of employees, right? Permanent employees, temporary staff, contractors, consultants, pay by the hour, gig workers. But what I'm finding often in organizations I'm working with, it's more like the lettuce and tomato. People aren't using these types of employment types for real competitive advantage, right? So, for example, asking questions like, well, what if we had a pay by the hour R&D team? What could that bring to us as an organization? What if we utilized a new temporary working model to tap into a diverse group of society that wouldn't normally work with an organization like ours? So that's what I meant about the work type salad. How do we utilize all of these different types of working and employment types, mix them into something that's really connected, convergent, and meaningful? And the other people have written about open talent and world without jobs, and obviously reference some of those books within my own book, but I see it as one meta wave amongst nine. But that one is really interesting. So I think in the real opportunity for modern organizations is to really stand back and think about what employment type will work for us based on our contexts, and then how will that tap into this globally diverse group of people that we can't necessarily attract in different ways. If you think about yourself, Aidan, I know we've had these conversations. I hope you don't mind me saying this. You're somebody a bit like me. You kind of like a free form portfolio type of working, right? And so if organizations want to attract and work with people like you, then they're going to have to go, well, actually, Aidan is our gig guy, right? But equally, if there's another person who's a deep, engineering technical expert who wants that security, that company also has to think about that and work with that on that side, and getting those things to work together. There's real magic there, if we can really tap into it.
I was thinking about the salads. Do you remember like Ireland in the 80s? If you got a salad, there
Oh
was
yeah.
always like that red onion, red onion on lettuce, like
Well, I also remember a friend of mine saying that to me. He said there was no such thing as a crunchy salad. It was a damp, limp, green leaf.
and you'd be happy to
And
have it.
tomatoes that were definitely vegetables as opposed to fruits. Only the Italians would call tomatoes fruits, at that stage. So yeah, I remember those.
A lot of tourists come over to Ireland and they'd ask me, people visiting as speakers or whatever, and they go, "Hey,
Yeah.
Aidan, will you recommend a good Irish restaurant?" And I go, "I'm not doing that to you. I like it
No,
too much."
yeah, that's a recipe for disaster. No pun intended. Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah. There's a list of 100. Just pick your own. Yeah,
let's move on to a couple of things. I love this idea of the wisdom world, the concept, and
yeah.
an organization creating their own wisdom world. Maybe we'll share a bit about that.
Yeah, so look, skills come up a lot, right, in terms of organizations, and I wasn't trying to be different, but I feel when we talk about this idea of a skills first organization, skills based organization, and it's, I talk about it a little bit in the book. What I was focused more on is what are we actually trying to get to with all of this stuff, and I came up with this idea of a wisdom world. How are we actually, number one, understanding people's skills at scale? How are we actually empowering people to learn at the quickest, most immersive ways possible? And then also, how are we actually tapping into all of this amazing tacit knowledge that's in organizations that leave when people go, right? And I'm sure, I know you've worked with a few organizations, you've a lot of very distinct ideas and perspectives. The minute you go, they're gone. You know what I mean? And we're forgetting legacy, the actual ideas behind it are gone, right? So I think for me, the wisdom world bit was around this idea of how do we utilize technologies like AI, but other things to understand and infer skills, right? So, for example, if Aidan is a guitarist, right, and he's in a band, we can utilize AI to infer that it's likely that Aidan is good with people. It's likely that he's pretty good communicator at 7 out of 10. It's likely that he's a decent presenter. So one of the things that people don't really talk a lot about AI in the talent world is the strength of inference. So Aidan has these broad level of skills, and we can actually infer what that's like. Now, once you get to that point, then it becomes around, well, how do we actually understand quickly how good Aidan is at that particular skill? So how do we understand in a 3-minute thing how good of a presenter Aidan is? I know you're a good presenter, Aidan, but just for word of example, right? Then we need gamified tools. We need immersive experiences that can quickly understand how good Aidan is at that skill, right? So we can think about ourselves now as this wisdom world, not just about being this broad level skills based organization, but really understanding, using AI tools to really understand skills base, really tapping into immersive reality properly, to help people understand their skill level, to improve their skill level. I spoke with an organization in Switzerland called InsightSphere, who basically have created an AI-based immersive experience for improving communication. And it extracts all information from all the TEDx talks around the world and gives you this kind of avatar around how you're doing. And then there's a company in Ireland called Immersive Technologies that create a really amazing immersive experiences in terms of medical device design, because you're obviously dealing with very high value pieces of equipment that you don't want to mess around with, right? So I think just that idea of utilizing these new technologies in a way that's building this new level of wisdom within the organization. You've probably heard of a company called Slick Plus, who I also interviewed. They're big into how do we capture implicit knowledge within an organization. So I think when we bring all of those things together, I'm really interested in that idea of utilizing, these experiential learning types, using AI at scale, using new platforms to capture implicit knowledge, to create meaningful wisdom worlds that where actually the level of knowledge is massively growing in an organization over time. And I think it's not probably talked at length enough. We talk about learning, we talk about a lot of skills development, but we don't necessarily talk about the chain from inference through to development through to retention.
One last one I'd love to share. You and I both share a love for Joseph Campbell and his work, Hero with 1,000 Faces.
I knew you'd know that one.
And all the myth stuff is, if you haven't, by the way, as a listener or viewer, read anything by Joseph Campbell, even look at his stuff on YouTube. It's absolutely fascinating about how to understand the structure of stories. You see it in stuff like Star Wars. You see it everywhere. Once you know it, it's a set of lenses through which to see the world. And I loved what you talked about, and it's something we talk a lot about in the show when we talk about the future of the world of work, is the idea that the 4 and 40 is dead. So the year go to college for 4 years, work in an organization for 40. It's now more like the opposite way around. You're learning for 40 years and you're constantly moving. Maybe you're working for 4 industries at the same time, let alone businesses. And you talk about the new hero's journey for work. And I thought that would be a lovely way to conclude and share this idea.
I think first and foremost, and you're absolutely right. I have this very simple concept in my head in that we've gone from this mono to poly career, right? And there's loads of different people talking about, as I like to say, they're talking about different versions of the same thing. So, the career is a squiggle, the career is this, the career is that. I think the most interesting conversation I had, I spoke to Connor Lynch, who's got, he's worked in marketing. I think Connor at some point, but he talks about career as asset development, right? Which is a really interesting concept. So, this idea of doing 10 things, but you're building assets over time. So you might be, you have a book, right? You're building an asset there. You might have a new tool that you've developed. You've got a side hustle, in the craft. You might have a full-time job as well. You might have some investments going along too. And so it all points towards this idea of we talk about the polymath. I like to talk about, the poly career, right? The poly experience, the poly journey. If we want to talk about that way. And it's the reason I mentioned the hero's journey, and you kind of alluded to it there, Aidan, is that, it used to be a case where the organizations, we were heroes, in their journey. In my view, it's turning the other way now, where we're the heroes, and organizations are part of our hero's journey, right? Now that's really interesting because it forces organizations to really think more and more like designers, and think about how can we actually impel people like Aidan and Barry to actually work with us, on certain projects or on special things, whatever those are. And I'm really interested in that. I'm interested in, I don't have an answer in the book. Just anybody's listening out there. I think there's a maximum level of experience that an organization can create for an individual. At which point, then an individual on their own can probably create. You love your S curves in, so they can probably jump to a more experiential career. So I'm really interested in that blend and poly stuff that's going on, where people like ourselves might be working with one organization 2 days a week whilst doing a book, whilst having be part of a broader network. And it's really, really interesting when you look at the younger generations and you start looking at their love for socialism, for collectivism. So we're seeing a massive growth in cooperative businesses, businesses that are owned by the people who work in them. And that's all part of this breaking through this barrier of, the experience, the work as experience plateau, into this more broader thing. So I think it's a really interesting thing that's happening. Even in Europe, 15 to 20% of us now are working on our own in some shape or form, and much, much bigger in America. And I think new technologies, new types of networks, super networks, they're all really going to drive different questions around what it means to work, and what it means to work with an organization versus working for. And I think if I was to sum up where I believe it's going, it's with versus for. It used to be about working for. We used to use the phrase working for. Now we use the phrase working with.
Beautiful. And it's such a timely book for that, even for the individual who wants to do
Yeah.
it, wants to jump the curve, but is maybe a bit reticent and a bit unsure about it. It helps you actually go, well, this is the way the world's going. Barry, for people who want to reach out to you for talks, keynotes, workshops, to find out more about the book, where's the best place?
Best place, so barrywinkless.com, and also on LinkedIn. We all love LinkedIn at this stage. And then book is on Amazon, it's on Barnes and Noble, it's on all the big sites as well, And also, I want to congratulate you on your Thinkers 50 as well. We'll have that on record, because I know that was I think it was a big goal of yours for a number of years. So, there's an example of the hero's journey in action.
I use it as a paperweight now. And I don't have any paper in my office.
Well, useful.
Author of Future World Work, How Leaders Can Create Destinations for Talent That Excite, Entice and Engage. Chief Strategy Officer at CPL and Head of the Future of Work Institute, Barry Winkless, thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Aidan.